Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Dimension Fold. We have with us today the author of two books. His name is Wallace Wagner, and he has written a couple of books on, sorry, what are the names of your books again? And they're slipping my mind.
Crossing the Crevasse,
Yeah,
and the one that just came out was Within Grasp.
right. And Within Grasp is the one that I was reading, and it's got some fascinating material in there. And is it okay with you if we talk about both of your books, or you want to
Sure,
mostly?
sure.
Okay. Yeah, because I think I would like to jump in with a couple of questions about crossing the chasm. Um, so my understanding is that you witnessed a UFO. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us about that.
I was delivering mail at the time. It was September of 2016. And I just made a delivery to a lady's house. And I was out in her front yard heading back to my Jeep. And something just told me to stop and look up. And that's exactly what I did. And kidding right over my head was what we now call a white TicTac variety of
Right.
UFO.
Okay.
I'm guessing it was about 50 feet by 30 feet.
Wow. What year was this?
2016, September of 2016.
Interesting, because I think it was in 2013 when there was that famous sighting over the USS Nimitz of the Tic Tac.
Correct. And it came
Yeah,
out, I guess, in 2017, about a year and a half later.
right. The video
The
was
government,
available then. Yeah,
gave us a little bit of a drip.
right. Only because they were being persistently hounded by certain individuals. Well, probably a lot of different people. So I'm not going to bother naming names, but yeah, there's been a lot of people who are really, that has been their focus, is attempting to persuade or to push for freedom of information
Mm-hmm.
and those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of disclosure side of things. So what? So this Tic Tac, I assume it was moving in the sky,
Actually, it was stationary.
stationary.
No windows, no nacelles. Appeared as a solid object, no
Yeah.
wings, definitely oblong, glistening white. It
Oh,
reflected white. It reflected the daylight.
okay.
I got to see it for about 3 seconds. And then all of a sudden, it's gone.
It was gone. Like, how did it leave?
That's a very good question. I've got three answers.
Okay.
It either took off so fast I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
It either went into another dimension or it cloaked. And
Right.
I'm putting my money on the last option.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. I haven't, I've been trying to find good videos, and they're hard to come by, because a lot of eyewitnesses are either, they don't have their phone, or it's too shaky and it looks like you can't tell what it is, or whatever. So I really put a lot of stock in the eyewitness reports, in terms of like your description, and because really that's kind of what we got right now. We don't have good pictures. Um, but I have seen a couple of videos that might have been real, that to me seemed like a ship was either uncloaking or cloaking. And so to say that or for you to say that you saw that happen right in front of your eyes is quite astounding.
The last thing I was thinking about was taking my cell phone out of my pocket. I was trying to
Yeah,
ascertain what I'm seeing, or what was I really seeing it?
exactly. And if you had started fumbling with your phone, you wouldn't have seen it.
Oh, I would have, by the time I looked back up,
Yeah,
it would have been
it-
gone.
yeah. Um, So yeah, I'm not like mourning the lack of video really in any way. I think that that's one thing that maybe needs to change more in the community, is that we just need to take people seriously when they tell us what they saw. Um,
Well, back then, you wouldn't want to have told too many people. I just
yeah,
told the Sunday school class, my wife, and a few close friends, and that's really about it. Back
really, eh?
then,
So yeah,
it was still kind of taboo to talk about, but since it's come out on the TV now,
yeah, it's really changed a lot
I
in
was
the last
vindicated,
what?
really. So,
Yeah, it's really just been the last 2 or 3 years where the culture has really kind of started to shift on
yes,
that.
sir.
Yeah. Um, how, I guess you didn't have a lot of time to see it, but for that 3 seconds, you told me that you were able to ascertain an estimate of the size of the ship, or the object, I guess, let's say.
That's a
Um,
guesstimate.
yeah. And then, so along with that, um, what elevation would you put it at? Like, how high off the ground was it?
Well, I was on about 900 elevation. And I originally had guessed maybe it was 2,000 feet. Now I'm thinking it's more like 1,500. I have gone back several times to look, and I'm
Okay.
guessing it's about 1,500.
So, so in terms of how far above you, like 1,000 feet, or
No, I'm gonna stick with the 1,500. That's what I mean when I say
oh,
that.
okay,
Yeah,
above yourself.
yeah,
Okay, which is pretty far.
it is.
I can't remember how many feet are in a mile because I we use kilometers up here, but um, it's that's about 500
That's about a quarter of a
meters.
mile, maybe.
Yeah, about a half a kilometer. That's a good fair distance. Um, so I mean, what kind of stuff flies in that? Not birds. Like no, birds aren't that high. Well, and you wouldn't see a bird that was that high anyway.
No, no.
Yeah,
But it was literally right.
interesting.
It was directly over my head. So it was a crystal clear day, blue sky,
And
uh,
just sitting there.
easy to see.
Yeah. Do you feel like it was watching you, or aware
That's a
that you
good
were there
question.
even?
I, I've always had an open mind, and I'm thinking it just let me know that it was there.
Right.
It let me know that I'm not alone, and we're not alone in the universe. Uh,
And
so from that
that in and of
standpoint,
itself.
it just
Yeah.
wanted me to see it. Let's put it that
Right.
way.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So that's a pretty startling revelation though, isn't it?
It was for me. I
Hmm.
grew up, Southern Baptist, Southern Methodist. All UFOs are from the devil, that
Right.
kind of thing. So, the earth is 6,000 years old.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. And
it changed me, that's for sure.
yeah,
And I've had a whole bunch of realities that have opened up for me since then.
right. So in that framework, and I think this is true, both within Christianity and probably most of the other world religions, and even in the secular world, there seems to be a sort of a base assumption that humans are like the pinnacle. In Christianity, we would say the pinnacle of creation, whereas maybe a secular person wouldn't use that exact same phrase. But there's still that mentality that we are the top, or the top of the food chain, as it were, um, which is, I find, kind of strange, but I understand why it's there, because that idea is just baked into um, both on the religious side. I guess it comes from the idea that God created a bunch of stuff, and then he created man and put man in charge. But even on the secular side, it seems that through the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the various philosophical kind of frameworks that we have come through in the last probably 500 years. It's been this very this concept that, you know, the Greeks were had some good stuff, and then the Romans did even better, and now we're always just building on that, and we're just getting so awesome. Um, well, like, where's the evidence that we've gotten any better? Okay, sure, we've built some really cool tech, and we can do a lot of things that you know we haven't been able to do in the past. That in at least in our remembered past, maybe we could do some of these things 10,000 years ago. Who knows? Um, but at least in the last several thousand years that are recorded, nobody's done the cool stuff that we've done. So therefore, we're the best. But at the same time, we're still destroying each other and
Exactly.
you know, shooting out the platform that we're standing on. Um, yeah, like it seems that maybe it's time to start thinking more like Gene Roddenberry, or you know, even
I'm all for
Captain.
that, Ken. I'm all for that.
Yeah, because it seems like we're at a bit of a dead end here, and we maybe need to expand not only our thinking but our footprint as well onto other planets.
If we
And
haven't
maybe
done
we
so
already have.
already.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good question. I wonder if whoever's out there are like how closely related to us they are. Like, have we come from them, or have they come from us, or have we both come from the same you know, ancestral root before we even got to Earth? Any thoughts on that?
I believe we're creatures of our environment for the most part. And if you look at all the purported alien races, maybe with the reptilians and the mantis aside, you know, we still have two arms, two legs, two eyes, ears, a mouth, a nose. You know,
Hmm.
I'm more inclined to think we're all brothers and sisters, uh, and we're on our own paths. And there's one God of the universe, and we all are his or her children.
Hmm.
That's my viewpoint now.
Right.
And it's
So
God, by the way, and I'm sure you know this. It's for me now. It's not the God of the Old Testament.
right. Right. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, both you and I have written books where there's clearly some major discrepancies between what we were taught in Sunday school and
Oh
what the
boy.
Bible actually
Oh
says,
boy.
and who God really
Gives me a
is.
headache.
Yeah, I exactly.
I went along with blinders so long it's almost embarrassing.
Yeah. I mean, the I find this topic possibly more fascinating than UFOs. Is just that um, you know what how I mean, aside from how it happens, or what any of that stuff, which are baffling questions, but just to explore some of these things where everything it seems that everything that I was taught is wrong, and and that's true of what I was taught in church as well as what I was taught in other places as well. But some of the church stuff is really interesting because it rocks you to the core, because it's, you know, you've been drilled in for many years that these are the ultimate important things that you need to know, and then they all
And you
start
know
to
this,
dissolve.
the mantra's been the same for the last 1600 years. It's an agenda.
Yeah.
Let's count the ways. Reincarnation disappeared. The Apostles' Creed says that there's one Son of God, when the Bible front and back is full of sons and daughters of God,
Right.
including us.
Right.
There just so much that there's crafts throughout the Bible, and these expositors, if they don't want to come out and say it, so they're real good at making up something to fit the agenda. And I've seen that so many times in so many different places.
Yeah.
There's an example of, and you know this, cloaked crafts in the Bible with Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha in Second Kings. They were there all along, and he prayed for his servant to have his eyes opened, and they were opened, and bingo, here's all these chariots of fire all
Oh,
around.
right.
They were there already, just couldn't see them.
Yeah.
Oh, there's chariots of God throughout. We're taught that this one God is this Yahweh God is Jesus's father, and they give us the lineage going from the Old Testament to the New Testament. I don't see it because it's different as day and night. The attributes of Yahweh versus the attributes of Jesus are 180 degrees difference, as you know.
Well, I mean, yes, I totally get what you're saying. However, I think maybe it's more complicated than that, because um, as I've been researching the last while, it's a lot of these things where in the Old Testament where Yahweh is portrayed, um, you know, in sometimes in ways that are he kind of looks like a jerk, like frankly.
Well,
Um,
that you're being kind.
well, yes. However,
Look at all the murders that
yeah,
the
yeah.
Israelites did.
Right. So, but here's the thing. Once you start to drill into the text, and you may or may not have to use any Hebrew interpretation here, because some of them are kind of just almost clear, even in the English translation. Like, for example, if you look at there was this time during the Exodus when um, there was the snake bites, right? Remember that? And however, it's really not clear what really happened there. Was there a snake, or was there some kind of UFO, or was there some kind of flying ship that, as I'm reading it now, it seems to be talking about an accident that basically infected a whole bunch of people, and to the point where they were probably going to die from radiation poisoning. And if that's the case, perhaps it was like more of a mercy thing that Yahweh decided to kill those people. So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying either way, but there's different ways that you can read some of these passages, and with dramatically different interpretations. One thing that I'm working on right now, for maybe my next book, or at least another book coming down the pipe along the way, is in the book of Job, where we generally read the book of Job as a poor guy and all this bad stuff happens to him, and then God comes along and gives him what for and just yells at him. Well, so that mostly occurs in Job 38. But as I'm reading Job 38 and I'm actually drilling into the Hebrew words, um, we have got that chapter so backwards and so twisted up. I don't see that as God asking Job questions at all. In fact, I think that Yahweh has come and he's telling Job and his friends a story about how we ended up being on Earth. And so that's a that's
Interesting.
an yeah, and it's so crazy. Like when
I've
you
got a
look at,
whole problem with the Job story anyway.
well, it's weird, right? Like the whole story
Well,
is weird.
he had the 10 children, and they get killed in the windstorm. And then to make it up, he gets double all of his cattle and belongings, which are material items, and then the 10
Mhm.
children get replaced. Well, what happened to the original 10 children? You can't tell me that just because you get 10 new children replaces your original 10 children.
Well, unless they
And
were
all this is because
reincarnated.
of a dare.
Yeah. Well, that makes you wonder, is that story about his children being reincarnated?
Well, I have thought about that. Just like when you read in the Old Testament, the sins of the fathers go down generations.
Mm.
Uh, if you just read that, verbatim, that's unfair. But what if they're really referring to, well, this is the same person in different incarnations that would face the penalty instead of somebody new and innocent? I've
Right.
thought about that too.
Yeah, it could be that, or I mean, I also am working on this really crazy theory where I can't really explain it at this point, but um, yeah, you know what? I don't even think I can even start to talk about that one. But okay, so let's say that one possibility there is that that it involves reincarnation, and I think a strong indicator of that is the transfiguration, where Jesus is standing on the mountain and with I believe it's John and Peter. I could have the
And James, all
and
three.
James, right?
That's his inner circle.
Yeah. And so these four guys are standing there, and all of a sudden there's two more guys. And so the apostles look at Jesus and they're like, what's happening? And Jesus doesn't say anything. He just starts talking to these guys. So the disciples turn amongst themselves and they're like, what is happening? And they clearly believed in reincarnation, because the only answers that they could come up with was it's Elijah or it's Abraham, I believe it was they were talking
Moses.
Moses, which is interesting. Like why would they say that unless they
How
didn't
would
think
they
that?
know that? There were no cameras, no pictures. How would they
Right,
know that?
right. Um, I almost wonder if instead of Moses, it would make more sense for them to have said Elijah and Enoch, because those two guys both got taken up into the sky. And it reads very, very suspiciously like a tractor beam going into a metallic spaceship.
And
Uh,
what was the cloud hiding?
yeah,
Always clouds, always on tops of mountains, always voices coming from the cloud, always looking up where the light comes from.
right,
Paths everywhere.
right. So it's interesting too, because there's clouds and there's also fire in almost every one of these occasions.
And
Well, where
thundering.
there's, yeah, so where there's smoke, there's fire, and where there's thunder and fire and smoke, I'm thinking some kind of rocket. But the thing that I'm stumbling on is, why would they have rockets? Okay, so granted, these instances occurred um, a couple thousand years ago at the earliest. So sorry, at the latest. So the Transfiguration was 2,000 years ago. Moses was at least 1,000 years before that, and Abraham was probably 500 years before him.
That.
I peg Abraham at around 2,500 BC. I might be a little bit off. So so if we're looking at a 2,000, let's say a 2,000 year period, from 4,000 years to 2,000 years ago, um, and then we jump to now as our modern UFO phenomenon, it seems to be using different technology. Back in the day of the Old Testament, um, the descriptions read like a rocket from the 1970s, which is really weird, because you can't get anywhere from any planet uh, through, to Earth, like light years away, with 1970s style rockets. They just don't go fast enough.
That is true.
So
That is true.
so that's one part that I have no explanation whatsoever on. However, it's I find it intriguing that Zechariah Sitchin really latched onto the whole rocket thing, and there's a lot of things that Sitchin says that I disagree with, but I think he's got some of the fundamental stuff correct. And he really seems to be into this whole rocket idea. I don't know if you're familiar with Sitchin's work or interested in
I've
any
got
of
all
that.
of his books. I've read
Okay.
about three of them.
Yeah,
And
so he
the
talks
rest are in the stack to read, but other books like yours keep popping up.
Well, that's good. Thank you for prioritizing me over Sitchin. He's
I
got so
enjoyed
many
your book
books, it's going to
immensely.
take you years to get caught up. But what do you think of this? So he uses the word Shem. Now, mind
Yep.
you, he's using the Sumerian source material, not Hebrew. But it's intriguing to me that Shem pops up in Hebrew as well. And it does so in a couple of different ways. Number one, and probably most obviously, Shem is the name of one of Noah's sons. He had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So that's interesting, but
Jim was
what do you
the
do with it?
oldest.
Okay. However, what I'm finding is so this is getting really tangential, and this is not what I had really prepared to talk about. But hey, what the hell? Let's do it. So you know, of course, that the Elohim ends in im, which is a suffix in Hebrew, which means plural. Right. But not only plural, it's also a plural being. Like it's indicating that there's some kind of,
Male and female.
yeah, either, yeah, exactly. So there's an entity, it's a at least reasonably intelligent, because sometimes the im suffix is used on animals, but most of the time it's on humans or better. And so what are these better things? Well, we've got cherubim, we've got seraphim, we've got, now this is where it gets interesting to me, and I'm sort of one of the main focuses of one of my books I'm working on now, is that you also have a few other of these people who nobody seems to know about yet. And those, the Mayim and the Shemim, which fascinatingly, the root word here is Shem, which is, again, back to this Zechariah Sitchin thing. So according to Sitchin, Shem means rocket. Now, I know that language can drift, and I know that language influences other languages, especially ones that are in next door countries or regions. And so we know that Sumeria was fairly close to Israel and Canaan, and so it's entirely likely that there was you know, they were influencing each other in terms of their language and their culture. Well, we know that for a fact because the Old Testament talks about it very specifically. It says that the Canaanites worshipped different gods,
Yep.
and many of these gods have been basically tied archaeologically, tied to the Sumerian and Babylonian. It's mostly Babylonian because of the time frame. The Sumerian was earlier than Babylon, but we also have the fact that the original Hebrew language did not use the same letters that it uses now. Different. They used to use a different alphabet. So
My studies have taught me that, and maybe you can elaborate on this, but there was only about 7,000 Hebrew words at the time the texts were
yeah.
written,
I don't know. I haven't actually looked at that.
compared to our 150,000 or more
Yeah,
English words today.
that seems believable to me, although I haven't looked into that. But what I was going to say was that the language that we know as Hebrew, in terms of the Hebrew alphabet that is in use today, was actually stolen from a Babylonian alphabet. So this happened during the time of the Babylonian captivity under Nebuchadnezzar and those other kings like him.
586 BC.
Yeah. So the Israelites, and literally the Hebrew Bible is written in Canaanite script, or sorry, not Canaanite script. Yeah, it's written in Babylonian, I think possibly Akkadian script that they. So basically, even if we had the oldest Hebrew translations, or sorry, original texts of the Bible, they're still actually translated because they went from the old Proto-Hebraic language which used Canaanite alphabet, and they were translated into the Babylonian alphabet. So already here, the Bible that we have that sort of accessible because the Hebrew language is very fascinating. Um, we're very lucky that it was preserved the way it has been, so that we can still access this very old copy of the Hebrew scriptures in what we now consider to be the Hebrew language, but really it's a Babylonian script. So that places it at around, like you said, 600, 500 BC. Whereas the stories that were supposedly written by Moses came from, if Moses wrote those stories down, he did so 1,000 years earlier and in a different language.
Well, I
Um,
think most of the scholars now are pretty well convinced that Moses did not write the Torah.
Yeah, and I think that there's strong evidence for that. But whatever, even if he did, it's not. We don't have the original language.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, okay. So I was talking about the Shemim, but anyway, I can't remember where I was going with it. But look for my book in the future, or I'll probably send you a copy when I get this book done. It's going to be quite fascinating because there's the Mayim and the Shemim, which we don't truly know how to interpret, but they
Yeah,
do appear
I
to
have
be.
not heard those names. I've
Yeah,
heard of the
and
Nephilim and the cherubim and seraphim.
exactly. So I'm digging into some virgin territory here, which is super weird because there have been Bible scholars for I don't know for how long. When did people start getting into the type of Bible scholarship that we see now with seminaries and that kind of thing? I mean, that people must have been interested in that 1,000 years ago. Maybe there was only one or two people. I don't know. But how is it possible that all this time, and it really makes me wonder what uh what Hebrew people, like what do Israelis who are Jewish, how do they deal with these uh discrepancies in the text? Where so the reason you have never heard of the Mayim is because every time that word comes up, and it comes up thousands of times. This is not a rare word. This is no hapax legomena here. The Mayim are mentioned in the Old Testament thousands of times. I think it was over 2,000. Um, but every time they come up, they are translated as water. It's the waters. And I think in some of those cases, I think that is an accurate translation. But I think that use case for Mayim being connected to water is because of the original use of the original meaning of the word, which with the I am ending clearly has to do with some kind of entity, some kind of living entity. So that's what I'm exploring there. Um,
Interesting.
it's it's insane, like the stuff that the Old Testament says about the Mayim. Not only the fact that they're there, but they are. Get this, in Job, um, it talks about how the Mayim were put in charge of the earth. What? I thought the humans were put in charge of the earth. And so I'm sure you're familiar with the book of Genesis and the first couple chapters fairly intimately. So in chapter 2, we talk. Is it chapter 2 where, or towards the end of chapter 1, where man, after God makes man, he blesses him. He says, "Be fruitful and multiply," and basically says, "You're in charge now." However, the really strange part about that is if you go back to Genesis 1:21, which is before that happened, um, God says the exact same thing to the Mayim. So the Mayim are created before the humans, and they're blessed. This is the only two times that the Elohim use this phrase, be fruitful and multiply. And he tells it to the Maim, and then later on he tells it to humans. So that's not in the Sunday school teaching that I heard.
Could that be part of the dichotomy that's present in Genesis? Because there's more than one writer. There
Yes.
seems to
So
be two story scripts as you read,
mhm.
and
So
some of them don't match.
right. So you're probably going to be you're probably referring to the documentary Hypothesis, where supposedly there was a group of the Yahwists and a group of the Elohists, and then there was a third group who later on did something. So basically, the idea is they mashed two different versions of Genesis into one. Yeah, that's a cool idea.
It didn't work too good for me.
It didn't work well, but I also think that I actually think that that's just entirely wrong. Even though it's true to a degree, I don't see it as two parallel accounts. I do see that there's definitely multiple creation stories happening in the early chapters of Genesis. So between chapter 1 and chapter probably 5, maybe even just chapter 3, I have identified at least 3 different narratives and possibly up to 6 different narratives where it's not just telling the same story in a different way, it's telling a different story that explains the same thing. So like I think the most clear part that explains that is if you look at Genesis 1:1, it's the 7 days of creation. It's the story that everyone knows. And then if you look at the second part in Genesis 2, I guess 2 or 3, wherever the next story starts, which is where we end up with Adam and Eve. In that story, so first of all, there in the first story, there's no Adam and Eve. There's just okay, he created a bunch of stuff and then he created man. In the second story, he created Adam and Eve. But this is not a continuation of the first story. This is a second story with a fresh start. So if you find the Adam and Eve story and then scroll back a bit to where it starts, you find a description of what the earth was like before men and Adam and Eve were created. And that description is entirely different from any of the descriptions of the days of the week that occurred in the first creation story. So it's impossible to reconcile Genesis 1 with Genesis 2. They're totally different stories.
Interesting.
Yeah. And again, why don't they just teach us, hey, there's 2 really cool stories. We have to learn one story. And so to do that, they have to skip those verses. So you've probably never heard, I wish I could remember what the actual verses are right now, because I bet you've never heard a sermon on those verses. And another thing, so I like that you brought up in your book, you were talking about in Exodus 24, where Moses and his buddies go up Mount Sinai, and they see the face of God, which is weird because also right in that same section, it says no one's allowed to approach the face of God.
You're exactly correct.
Yeah.
That's often overlooked.
It's always overlooked because no one's ever said it. You don't preach a sermon that and show your own discrepancies. Well, you should be, because if you're preaching the word, preach the text that's in front of you. And you don't have to do any digging. It's right there. It's in every single English translation.
That is one place where that contradiction is just a few lines away.
Yeah.
But
Now
First
it's
John
even
says nobody sees God anyway, and I'm a
right,
First John believer. So
right. Well, so how do you reconcile those? Now it's even crazier than you have already pointed out, because go back and read that chapter again, and you'll notice there was actually 75 people with
well, there were
Moses.
the 70 that went up too,
Yeah,
plus Aaron and his two sons
yeah,
and Moses.
yeah.
But
And
there were other
probably,
people. There were other people that saw this Yahweh character also.
yeah,
Laura for sure.
right. So 75 people are going up a mountain and they sit down and actually have supper with the Elohim, is what
In
it
a
says in
dining
there.
hall inside the
Yeah,
ship.
yeah, exactly. Now, even without a ship, even if you just read it as guys going up a mountain and there's no UFOs at all, how is it possible that 75 men sit down with the Elohim for dinner? Well, like last I checked, the concept of God that I've been taught, he doesn't have dinner, and he sits on his throne. So why is he sitting on a mountain having dinner? This is really weird.
But for me, when I read about the throne that they see and that John in the New Testament saw, that's just the control central for the ship.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, or I've found some evidence that indicates it's either it could be like a almost like a Captain Kirk kind of a thing where
That's exactly correct. I
or
fully believe
it
that actually.
yeah, I think so. I think so for sure. In some of the descriptions, it seems that way. But specifically in the Exodus 24, to me, it sounds like I don't think Yahweh was actually on board the ship. I think that there was a bunch of crew members, the Elohim, and but it seems from the description of what they call his throne, and oddly, they talk a lot about the floor, this blue, amazingly beautiful, transparent sapphire floor. And so to me, that sounds like some kind of hologram where Yahweh is skyping or zooming in to the the feast that these
Could
guys,
be.
these humans and Elohim are having.
But I see connections between that, what Ezekiel saw, and what John saw, all three.
Yes, absolutely. And they all use very similar terminology. Uh,
Exactly.
some of the words are different, but if you look at the descriptions of what they're trying to say, they match up very closely.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, yeah. And the Ezekiel's a really interesting um, reference point because he has not one, but I can't remember how many exactly, but he has several separate different instances where he has some kind of visitation. And we generally are familiar with the wheels within wheels and that one, which comes from Ezekiel 1, which is his first encounter. And this guy is dumbfounded. He is baffled. He has no idea what's happening. So he tries to explain it. Like, I think he just went home and wrote in his diary and was just like, what was that? And he just kind of described it the best he can. Later on, um, after several more of these encounters, he begins to learn some of the lingo. There's actually a quote in there where he says that he heard some of these components called by name. So somebody there, like, and he's talking about cherubim and seraphim and all these things, and he apparently some of these beings were either telling him what stuff was called or like what they called it or explaining things or trying to teach him about the craft, almost giving him like a walkthrough, or maybe they weren't talking to him, but he just overheard them talking to each other, much like we would hear today if we happened to be at Cape Canaveral when the space shuttle is launching, and they're saying things like engine check, engines go, stuff like that. Like this is the kind of stuff that it sounds like he's hearing. And he's able to describe his these later experiences with a lot more, well, with different detail and with different words. And because he's learned what some of these lingo things are. And some of that is the cherubim, which we still really have no clue what the cherubim is. But I look at that in quite a bit of detail in my book and look at a few different possibilities. But there's certainly not a man with a pair of white feathery wings.
Well, that's what we've been taught. That's the picture
Yeah,
you see.
right. And another weird part about it is, so remember when the cherubim were supposed to be on top of the Ark of the Covenant, right?
Yep.
So, so Yahweh
They're
tells
at the Garden of Eden too, aren't they?
they were there
Oh,
with a
yeah.
flaming sword.
Yep.
So the understanding that we're taught is that Yahweh told Moses how to build the Ark of the Covenant, and that he needed to carve out these um, golden cherubim, or like cast them in gold, which is highly unbelievable when you read the Ten Commandments, because what is the second commandment? You shall not make any image of anything under in the sky or on the earth. So why would he immediately turn around and tell Moses to do that? It just doesn't make sense.
Same way he told Moses to kill all the Midianites, I guess. I mean,
Well, maybe. I I think that Yahweh knows something that we don't know. And
well,
so
I'm
we're
sure he does. I'm sure he does. But he was treated as a god.
yeah,
Although my studies seem, what resonates with me is that he was a local god. This
absolutely.
Yahweh God was definitely a local Canaanite God,
Yeah.
and he
Well, that
really was maybe a relative or a son of El, which was the chief Canaanite god.
yeah, that's I don't interpret El as a god, because in my etymological understanding, El just means still the Elohim. It's always the plural, even if the im isn't there. It's the short form, I guess. But I mean, it's possible. It's entirely possible. Um, what other evidence have you seen in the Bible itself, like within the biblical text, that would indicate that Yahweh is local rather than universal?
Well, things I have read, like to give you an example, it was possibly a local god of copper smelting.
Mm,
That's one line of thought. Another thought, he was a local god of the Shasu, which were basically cattle, nomads. And that's
okay.
actually on some text that have been found in Egypt that said Yah
Okay.
was the god of the Sashu. So those are the two general mainline avenues that seem to support that Yahweh was a very local god. As you know, information on Canaan's hard to come by because over time and all the wars and whatnot, it's pretty much vanished. But let's
Right.
get
Well,
serious. So
I wonder how much of that stuff Joshua personally smashed and burned. Right? Like they were really on a
good
tirade
question.
there.
Good question. But there is
But
that one phrase in the Bible that Joshua actually made an altar to El. It wasn't to Yahweh specifically; it was to El. So it was either to the chief god or, as you might say, the Elohim.
right,
It wasn't to Yahweh.
right. Unless Yahweh might have been one of the Elohim.
Well, that I'm pretty convinced of that.
Yeah, I think
And I'm
so.
also convinced that Baal may have been one also.
Yeah, Baal. Yeah. So here's where it gets kind of strange and interesting. in some of the there's this set of, I guess I'll say, documents, although I'm still not really clear on what these are when people are referring to the Ugaritic texts. And so Ugaritic is another language that that was roughly contemporarily with either the Israelite occupation of Canaan or sometime during the Babylonian period, or some. I need to do more research in that. But these texts apparently refer to the 70 sons of I've there's another god that is supposedly, there was a god who had 70 sons, and he
Well,
parceled out
supposedly
all the
El
land.
had 70 children.
Okay, yeah. So this is the same story, but there's some regional twists on it and maybe different names.
I'm
Uh,
sure.
yeah.
They were
So
both male and female, by the way, and this El possibly had a wife,
right,
and just like you and me, they had children. His wife's name was Ashua, and she was venerated all through the Jewish culture, even in Solomon's temple. When the Bible
yeah,
got written, it was a man's world, so she got axed, and
right,
Jehovah inserted. And
right.
now Jehovah's been taken out, and Ashua has been put back 40 times in the NIV.
Oh, okay. All right, is that Asherah? Is that what you're saying?
Asherah.
Okay. So they have, I remember the Asherah poles where,
That's what that is. She
yeah.
was venerated by a pole or a stick, or sometimes a
Okay.
tree.
So some of the Israelite kings were into worshiping Asherah, worshiping, I'll use the term loosely, and some of them were directly opposed to it. So it's kind of like what happens every time there's an election and you get, you switch back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. All of a sudden, some of the laws change, or at least they try to change them, right? Not always successfully. But you see this happening through the Old Testament tons of times. Every time, not every time there's a new king, but depending on which king dies and whoever takes over next, you
Mm-hmm.
get this waffling back and forth. And some of the kings were very, very adamant that only Yahweh was to be worshipped, and so they would go around and they would cut down all the Asherah poles, and they would kill the priests of Asherah and do all kinds of terrible things. Then usually when the Asherah people came back into power, they seemed to be a lot nicer. They weren't going around killing all the Yahweh people. So maybe that's interesting, but um, maybe that's because they were had more of a balance between the feminine side. Um,
Well, Yahweh had a propensity to murder and to kill. I mean, he had
yeah,
very little respect for human life, in my opinion. I mean, look
yeah,
at everybody that got killed, and they weren't put in jail, and they weren't indoctrinated, they weren't given land, they were murdered in situ.
yeah,
I mean,
right.
tribe after tribe after tribe after tribe.
Yeah. No, you're right about that. I can't even argue. Yeah, that like the Canaanites were just
And then
completely
going back to the
decimated.
Ten Commandments, thou shalt not murder,
Right.
unless I tell you to.
Right. Unless it's somebody I don't like. But so why would Yahweh not like these people? If Yahweh was the creator of all people, you would think that he would like all of his children. But Yahweh wasn't the creator, and nor did he ever claim to be, because
Exactly. He never claimed to be.
back in Genesis, it's not
He's
Yahweh talking.
Israel's God.
Right,
Israel's God.
right.
The God of
So
Israel.
so Joshua, when Joshua took over from Moses after Moses' death, Joshua said a very strange thing, and he's talking to the people. It's basically his coronation, his first day as leader of Israel, and so he gives a big speech. And what he says there is a very famous line, which I'm sure you will recognize immediately. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We will serve Yahweh, is literally what it says. So, why does he say that? Well, reading back just a couple verses ahead of that, here's how he prefaces that statement. So he's telling the entire nation of Israel, "Hey, you guys, I'm your new leader, yay!" And he goes, "Okay, so remember when Abraham came across the river, and his father and his father's father, so Terah and Haran, uh, literally, this is what Joshua says. Terah and Haran worshipped other gods across the river. So now Abraham came across the river and he stopped worshiping those gods and he started following Yahweh. And so you guys can basically, what he's saying is, if I'll paraphrase a little bit, is he's saying, you guys can choose to do whatever you want. I'm your new leader, but I'm not really interested in like trying to control you really. So you guys choose. I'm going to choose to follow Yahweh. You guys feel free to choose Terah and Haran's gods that your grandfather, great great grandfather used to worship. Go ahead. Now, it doesn't say anything about the territory there in terms of like, if they were going to choose that, would they have to go back to across the river, which was, by the way, Sumeria, which is where Sumer, which is where also Babylon and the Akkadian texts are from. So I find it fascinating that as soon as Abraham crossed the river, he seems to be under the authority of a different Elohim.
That brings up an interesting point. I have read, and I put this in my book, that this El, or Elohim, with the 70 children, he gave each of the children specific parcels of land on this planet.
Right.
So that would tell me that there were multiple gods everywhere, including
right.
including other gods. And the word gods, plural, as you know, is mentioned throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I mean, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's far more common than the word Yahweh.
Exactly.
Well, I think that yeah, this has been something that was probably intentionally covered up, because at some point somebody decided in somewhere in Judaism that oh yeah, no, there's only one God. No, there's only ever always been one God. So it seems like they sort of tried to change the story.
Poor Jerome must have had his work cut out trying to appease the canonists, the new leaders of the church, trying to appease the Jews on one side, the Greeks on the other, trying to put all this together in one book.
Yeah.
I don't think it should have ever been bound together. I think the Hebrews should have had their own book with their own God, and then the New Testament be something separate, focused on Jesus. That's my personal opinion, but I have a hard time connecting the two anymore. I mean, it's just different day and night.
That's a fascinating idea. I would actually go one further. I would say that there should be the Old Testament separate, there should be the Gospels separate, and then all the stuff that Paul wrote. I was going to say all the crap that Paul wrote, but because Paul does not reflect the teachings of Jesus in any way, shape, or form.
There is,
in my opinion,
there is a difference.
Yeah.
And you're not the only one to have that opinion, by the way. I've read other opinions that concur with you.
Okay. So I guess that's really the key, is that there's these things that are like so huge, that why aren't we talking about them? Like, I guess what would have happened if somebody pointed out these things that you're pointing out, and that I'm pointing out, and that there's a few other authors right now who are putting out these books like this, where it's like, hey, the Elohim are plural, guys. Hey, what's going on?
I know exactly what would happen. The coffers would dry up in the mainstream denominations. That's exactly what would happen.
Why do you think?
Pardon?
well, I wonder why. Like, I mean, you're probably right, but what's the logical flow? Is it because should we factor in hell here? Is the real factor that hell is a fake news
Well,
that's trying to scare everyone
that's
into
causing
giving?
it. That's one of the schisms in the Methodist Church right now. There's several pastors even here locally that don't believe in hell, and that's really rubbing the conservatives the wrong way.
Right.
So
And it's interesting to note, and probably most people haven't noticed this, but hell is not a part of the Bible until Paul comes along. Jesus doesn't talk about hell. Hell is not in the Old Testament, and Judaism still doesn't have a concept of hell. Um, so
the only thing I can find about hell was the north side of the third level. If you read the book of Enoch, it's a cold, dark place where you can be tormented. But
right.
supposedly, in all these levels, that's still part of the kingdom of heaven. So it's
Okay,
open for interpretation.
But Enoch was talking about like probably different planets and stuff.
Could very well have been.
I
I
mean,
don't
who
know that.
knows?
I do not know that.
We're not supposed to know about Enoch though, right?
Well, then why do they leave him in there? I mean, it's referenced
Yeah.
in Jude.
Yeah,
That's another issue yours truly has. We either infer or mention other books.
right.
Where are they? Where's the book of Asher? It's mentioned
Right,
twice. You
right.
know,
Yeah, if they're gonna try to expunge the Book of Enoch, they probably should have taken that black marker to Jude and to Genesis 6. So, but maybe they forgot, or they didn't realize those were there. That's totally possible. Um, there's a couple of other instances like that that are super weird. Um, you already mentioned the Nephilim. In that same verse that talks about the Nephilim, it says that they were the mighty men of old. The in fact, this is where this comes back to the Shemim thing I was talking about, because one possible interpretation of Shemim is the famous ones, and so this is what it works in the context here, because um,
men of renown,
Genesis, yeah,
possibly.
yeah, exactly. It's the men of renown. So in Genesis 6, they actually do translate Shemim as the famous guys. So they call them the men of renown. But then everywhere else they translate it differently. So it's fascinating that there's this one reference left in there for these basically these legendary dudes, right? Like the Nephilim are the giants, the men of renown, the sons of the Elohim,
Oh,
sires
our
them.
Bibles are all over the place on Genesis 6.
Oh yeah.
They don't
So
know what to make it. They don't know what to make of it.
right, but here's the thing. If there are men of renown, that means they're famous. So basically, the writer of that chapter of Genesis 6 was saying, hey, I'm talking about something that you already know about because they're these famous guys from legend. From legend. Oh, you mean like from other books and stuff?
Well, we're only
Yeah,
in
from
Genesis chapter 6.
right. Exactly. So what legends are they talking about? They're talking about the Sumerian legends. The Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian tradition, which has guys like Ea and Enki and
Thank you. Yep.
Enlil and Marduk. And a lot of these stories are actually paralleling some of the stories that are in the Bible, but
Yep.
it's
I
hard
put
to
the
tell.
Epic of Gilgamesh in the appendix of my first book, Crossing the Crevasse. And
Right.
that's
And
basically, the Akkadian description of the flood 1,000 years before
yeah,
Moses.
exactly. So clearly there's I'm not going to necessarily call it plagiarism, but clearly there's some retelling of the same old story, which is good and actually what you would expect because that's what humans have been doing for a million years since we learned how to talk, is we tell stories. So why suddenly try to cut ourselves off from these ancient stories? I think that's a really terrible idea, and there's I don't even know what is the motivation behind it necessarily. Um, but this again comes back to the thing I was talking about of Job 38, because Job 38, the way I'm translating it, by taking out all the words that are not supposed to be there and looking only at the Hebrew words, I end up with a story rather than a set of accusatory insults from Yahweh. And Yahweh's actually telling these guys a story, and that story is almost identical to the story of the Enuma Elish from the Sumerian myth. So the more you start to dig into the ancient texts, the more they all start to look the same. There's also parallels with some of the ancient Sanskrit writings from India, which so I'm kind of trying to explore some of this stuff. But
these gods that have been on this planet, regardless of location or culture, they always come down. They're
yeah,
never omni anything.
right,
Why do you have to come down if you're God?
right. And also they
They
don't
don't free
simply,
fall when they come down either.
yeah, exactly. They they don't have wings. They're never described with wings. They're described as being in the sky, but not with bird-like wings. They never come up from the ground. They never come out of the water. Well, except for one of the Sumerian traditions, there's a guy who comes out of the water. But yeah, almost in every case, they're in the sky and they're flying around and they're moving fast. So what do I know that is in the sky and flies around and moves fast? A tic-tac. And you've seen it
And
with your
Joel
own
says
eyes.
leaps from mountaintop to mountaintop.
Right. Right. Which and that part rings strangely reminiscent of what Admiral Byrd said when he came back from Operation Highjump.
High
Uh,
jump.
yeah,
You know
right.
about high jump.
They're able to fly from pole to pole very quickly. There's nothing we can
Exactly.
do about it.
And a lot
Yeah.
of people wrote that off as maybe him going a little bit crazy. But
Yeah.
I believe in what happened with Operation High Jump.
You know what? If that guy was going crazy, there is no freaking way that the US military would let him stay in charge of the entire Navy fleet. He personally was the number one man in the Navy. He served very gallantly and bravely for many years and was awarded many medals.
Exactly.
He was
Exactly.
not given a dismissal.
And we
He
limped back home.
yes, yes, exactly. And
Very
I
interesting
believe
too that it was 1 year after World War II ended.
right.
Very short time, actually.
Right. Yeah, actually, there's a ton of really cool videos out on YouTube about Operation High Jump. So, for any of the listeners who are not familiar with it, go check some of those out. One of the actually one channel that I really like is called the Y Files, and he does a really great investigation on Operation High Jump, although he concludes in the end that there were no UFOs and no aliens, which I don't know. Maybe he's
Well,
being a little too skeptical because
from what
there's
I've read, there's
some
this one quote, they did come right out of the ocean.
yeah,
So
yeah. There's a lot of very strange things in that story, but also I believe there's also some parts of that story that were added later and probably are suspicious. But either way, do you guys do your own research on high jump, on UFOs, and on all this crazy stuff that we're talking about, because Lord knows we do not want to tell you what to believe. Uh, we're just telling you that there's something strange going on, and when we started digging into it, it only got stranger. So
these crafts have been with us since day one, and they're with us
yeah,
till today.
yeah, and there's been records of them all throughout
Sure.
history,
Yep.
in the medieval times, in the
Yep.
Roman
Look at
Empire.
Nuremberg. Nuremberg was most, back in the 1500s was not that far back. And we have fairly good written documentation that two competing forces in the sky were battling each other.
Right, right. Like, and that's also what happened in the Indian the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very old story, which probably dates to around 5,000 years ago. And so we have the same type of thing where there's vehicles flying around shooting each other, and with possibly like lasers or torpedoes, and maybe even with nuclear capability. So yeah, there's just so much crazy stuff. I guess, is there anything else that you wanted to touch upon?
Oh boy.
Like
Um,
specifically, I mean, yeah, we could go on for hours, I'm sure, but
this has been enlightening.
yeah,
You know, I guess going back to me not subscribing to any individual, mainstream religion now. If you think about it, neither Yahweh nor Jesus set any people out to destroy Hinduism.
right.
And Hinduism and Buddhism and Zoroastrianism and had all been, in their respective cultures and countries hundreds of years before Judaism.
Yeah.
And I haven't read any command aside from modern day Bible teachers or whatnot that Christianity's, the only truth out there. Everything else is a religion. I'm really bothered by statements like that now because, Jesus came to build up. He did not come to destroy. And nowhere did he say you need to destroy all the other religions on the earth.
Right.
It kind of bothers me a little bit now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now,
I take the good things out of all the religions, and I
yeah,
look at the teachings of the individuals, and I look at Jesus now as a teacher more than a savior. And if you focus on his teaching aspects, I've come to realize that we really have learned very little.
yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, so now some people are going to come back and say, well, okay, Jesus said that, I have come to turn brother against brother, or something like that. I don't think I can quote it directly, which is true. He did say something like that, but I don't think he meant what you think he meant. I don't think that he's giving you license to go out and be a dick to your family or to disown your family. I think what he's saying is, once you realize the truth, you may not be able to hang around with some of the crowd that you
That's
used to hang around
exactly
with.
what he's saying. That is exactly what he's saying.
Yeah.
And if I had to leave the listeners with a good verse, it would be, John 14, what you often hear at a funeral. But later on in that same verse, Jesus says he's going away. If he goes away, it's good for us because we'll be able to do miracles and works greater than what he did.
Right.
I found that to be a loaded statement because I
Right.
know of no one that's done works equivalent to Jesus, let alone greater.
Yeah.
So it's talking about future incarnations.
Well, okay. Let's dig into that a little bit. Like, okay, I went through a phase where before I got into UFOs, I was getting into Jesus, and I was reading the Gospels, and I read Matthew like 5 times in a year. And I noticed one thing, and that is this: Jesus was ultimately, first and foremost, a healer. He, every day, what he did was he would go out and he would heal people. There are only 2 occasions that I can think of. I might be missing 1 or 2. I'm not perfect. There are only a couple of occasions where Jesus taught, like in terms of like literally telling people stuff. of course, he was teaching his disciples all the time with hands-on training. Uh, but there's the Sermon on the Mount is kind of the main go-to thing that we have, where Jesus was like using our kind of style of teaching. Like, it almost looks like church. There's a guy up there talking and everyone's listening. That happened 2 or 3 times with Jesus. That was not his everyday modality. His everyday modality was walking around, talking to people with no regard whatsoever to their race or class or any of that other background kind of stuff. He loved everyone unconditionally. He gave the same treatment to everyone, regardless of age, and even the sick and the untouchables in his society. He treated them the same way. He didn't care if you were poor or rich. Um, he didn't care if you could pay for his services. I believe that sometimes he did get paid for his services, but he didn't care. He would give you the same treatment no matter what.
I can't find a
And
place where he ever even touched money.
uh, you can make a case with some of the women being some of the women in his entourage were apparently very wealthy. Um, so, I don't know. It's not really what I want to get into. I don't care either way whether Jesus was poor or rich. He didn't care about that for any of his people. But what I did see is that he was healing, and so when I saw that, I began to try to do healing, and I began to really seek out the Holy Spirit. And lo and behold, it worked, and I actually healed a number of people, and I myself was also healed. Um, Now, I'm
I
not
would
doing that.
like to talk about that sometime.
Sure, yeah, for sure. Let's maybe come back another day and talk about that. But what I wanted to get at was um, he did these things, and so when he says greater things you will do, it's greater than that. It's greater than healing. It's greater than walking on the water. Now, his disciples did heal as well. Paul and Peter, even though I'm not really a big fan of Paul necessarily, he did apparently do healing. Peter also did healing. Uh, Paul might have been one of the best healers around. It says in one of his, I think it was in Acts, one of the stories of Paul was that he was on an island and he preached to the island, and every single person on the island was healed. Well, I don't know how many people that was, but it was hundreds or thousands. Um, so that's pretty cool, and in a way that's greater than what Jesus did, because I don't recall any instance of Jesus doing mass healings. Um, so when Jesus left and he said that, and don't forget, this is the same basically the same time where I guess it was a couple days before, where where the disciples were there and thought they saw the reincarnated um, Elijah and Moses. And then a couple days later, Jesus himself seems to fly up into the sky. What? So, do you think that Jesus was taken aboard a UFO or a ship of
Definitely.
some kind?
Definitely. I
Yeah.
believe Jesus was in a UFO when he talked to Paul on the Damascus Road,
Oh, yeah.
because the light shone down
Right.
around Paul just like it did the shepherds. It came from a craft. A voice was heard, just like with the
Right.
shepherds. There's always that voice emanating from the sky.
Yeah. And Paul literally says right there that it was Jesus that talked to him.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't think I noticed that part. I do talk about that occasion, but I don't think I noticed that Jesus was in there, which is
And then where did Paul
kind of
go for
obvious.
training? He went to Saudi Arabia for training before he became an apostle. It's easy to think that he immediately became an apostle right after that
Yeah.
experience. He went off to Saudi Arabia for 3 years of training, and nobody knows who really trained him. And then he comes back to be an apostle. Now this is some 7 years after the apostles were chosen. And now he has powers he did not have before with that 3 years of training.
And
That's
this
when
was
he could
after.
heal. That's when he could look at Elymas and blind him just by
Okay.
looking at him. He didn't have those powers before. He was a tent maker.
This
You
was
know,
after his UFO experience.
after his UFO
Yeah.
experience and after his training in Saudi Arabia.
So Paul sees a UFO. He hears Jesus talking to him from the UFO. Then he goes to Saudi Arabia. He's trained by someone who we don't know who. Then he comes back with miraculous powers.
Yep.
Yeah. Again, that's not how they teach it at church.
Not either.
No.
It's this training. I make mention of that, and that's why I interviewed one of the Project Stargate remote viewers for Within Grasp, my latest book.
Yeah.
Is all the brain power that we're not using. And if you focus on Jesus being a teacher and you focused on him teaching us to use our brains in different ways, just like Peter stepping out of the boat. You know, the
Right.
first step he took, he actually walked on water by
Right.
himself until he panicked and called out to Jesus for help. So
Right.
you know, I think Peter got a little bit of what Jesus was trying to teach, but
Right. So is it possible that Jesus was actually was maybe his mission was really to teach humankind how to, I'm going to say, regain lost powers or skills of that we would now call some kind of psionic or ESP or some type of these kinds of abilities like
possibly,
remote
yes,
seeing.
possibly.
Yeah, and there's a couple of occasions in the Bible where people turned to one another and said to their friend, how does he know what I'm thinking? Right? Remember that? I think one of them was a
Telepathy.
Pharisee. Yeah. So it seems like Jesus had telepathic powers. He definitely had some, I don't know if
Remember
it's,
the lady who touched his coat? Who
yeah,
touched
that's right.
me?
That's right. There's a couple of scenes where Jesus is surrounded by crowds and he suddenly disappears either through teleportation or becoming invisible. We don't know the details, but those are the only two ways that you can be surrounded in a crowd and suddenly you're not there. He either walked away and nobody saw him because he was invisible, or he maybe shapeshifted or something too. I guess there's a couple different ways to do it, but something strange is going on. And then he goes up in his craft and says that we're going to do even more. So then you did mention John, the Revelator. So the revelation of John is super weird. Um, I don't think anyone even claims to understand what. Well, I mean,
Well,
there's
first of
people
all,
who,
how do you see a door open in heaven?
yeah,
For them, any heaven is anything looking up. Uh,
right,
and this door opens. What if it's a literal door
right,
and you're told to come up here
yeah.
and you go up
That's
there?
that's what it
And,
seems like to me.
and the interesting thing is, in every translation, including the Koine Greek, you are going up into the spirit.
Right,
I'll make a point that spirit needs to be looked at because there are many instances the word spirit, in my estimation, is a craft. And I go
yeah,
back to Zechariah chapter 6.
right,
The chariots are coming out between the two brass mountains.
right,
He's told that they are spirits. So
yeah.
these
and,
chariots of
and the
fire could also be in certain instances. Remember, there's just a few Hebrew words,
yeah,
but you need to look at it closely to see if it makes sense. Is this a craft?
absolutely.
Spirit
In
came
many
down at
cases,
Jesus' baptism. You don't see a spirit. How do you
right,
see a spirit come down?
right.
And then there's
In
that voice again coming out of the spirit. This is my son with whom I'm well pleased, and all
right,
those. So it's all the
right.
time. It's
That
throughout.
that one almost sounds to me more like one of um these orbs, like now people are seeing glowing orbs.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
it's like almost like a Tinkerbell kind of a fairies style thing that's when it's just like a light, but it's not way up in the sky. It comes down and it comes right near you, and you can see it right in front of you. And these are being encountered as a phenomenon. This is happening um, all around the world currently, and so it's again, it's interesting. You know, you go through these phases where they look like rockets, then maybe for a while they look like tic-tacs. Now maybe they're just glowing orbs. There's the whole saucer thing. Like, so it's interesting that there seem to be different phases. I don't know why that would be. But then you're right. In the Old Testament, they talk about the spirit, and the Hebrew word for spirit is ruach. And in many of those instances, it is very clearly some kind of flying craft. Sometimes the ruach is picking people up. In the case of Elijah, it's the ruach. But there's other words too. It's not always ruach. Sometimes it's the cherubim. When David in the Psalms talks about flying objects, he always calls them the cherubim. But he talks about them as with Yahweh riding on them, and he talks about them shooting laser beams at his enemies. Like that's in the Psalms. I can't remember which one, but if you want to know more about that, check out my
There's
book.
a
I know
pretty good
you've already
story
read it.
about that in Joel too, where it's a lush green, like Garden of Eden in front, and these chariots go out,
Yeah.
destroy everything, and then behind them there's nothing but desolation.
Oh wow. I'm not familiar with that story. I got to check that one out. Yeah, there's just so much crazy stuff. Now, so back to Revelation, the only thing that makes any sense to be in Revelation is I can't remember which chapter, but I believe it's towards the end, where after John sees all this crazy stuff, um, and you know, a lot of people try to interpret that with like political reasons or whatever. Like, I don't know, I don't get that. But what I see is John is describing some really strange things that he saw, and then he ends the story with this gigantic cube that's like I think it was 100. Do you know the dimensions of this thing?
It's 1,500 by 1,500 by 1,500
Feet,
miles.
miles,
Big.
1,500 miles. So this is like 1,500 miles. That's 1,000 miles. So to put that into perspective, the circumference of the Earth is 30,000 miles, no, kilometers, 30,000 kilometers. So that's about 20,000 miles. So, but that's circumference, not radius. So if you're looking at, if you put the Earth and the New Jerusalem side by side, they're not going to be the same size, but they're on the same ballpark scale.
Well,
You're
you'd
going
be
to be
able to
able
see
to,
it for sure.
yeah, you'd be able to
It's
see it.
about halfway between. It's like New York City to Kansas City, Missouri.
Right. Maybe it's a little smaller than the moon. Maybe I'm just roughly guessing here. I can crunch these numbers for you guys and let you know. But basically, John tells us that he sees this gigantic cube coming down into an atmosphere, which is clearly not on Earth, because the atmosphere of Earth cannot accommodate something that big. I guess it could land on Earth. Okay, so maybe it is. Maybe it's landing on Earth. It's landing somewhere. There's no room for argument on that. John is very clear that this gigantic cube is landing on some planet, and then he goes on to describe, you know, how beautiful everything is. It's all going to be really cool. Which basically his point is, we're going to be on that ship, and
Correct.
that's like mainstream Christianity. That's not considered weird. Um,
Well, you haven't heard a sermon put together just the way you described it, have you?
Well, not exactly that way, maybe.
Well, me either. But
Yeah,
that will be interesting times for sure. And you know, it's interesting because, you know, if the kings will be coming and going, so it's going to be like a two-way street in
right.
some regards.
Like going in and out of
In
this
and out
ship,
of
you
this
figure?
cube, coming back to the planet or coming back to the society on this planet.
Right.
They
And
will have the leaves for the healing of the nations, remember?
right, right. And there's no need for a sun and moon because the whole place is just lit. And also it reminds me of what Jesus said just before he left, is that in my Father's house there are many mansions. So how big is that going to be? Yeah, it's about the right size. I wonder if you could fit 8 billion. Well, how many billion people are on the planet now, plus all the ones that have lived before us, which most of the time were a lot fewer. The Earth has never had uh, the same number of people that are here now. This is we're probably
Aren't we around
approaching
8
maximum.
billion now?
Yeah, and we're probably approaching maximum capacity. But if you take the 8 billion that are alive now and all the millions that have been here throughout the ages, I wonder if you could fit them all into a cube that was 1,500 miles wide. I wonder. Somebody can probably crunch the math
1,500
on that.
miles tall too. So
Tall too, yeah, yeah, tall. It's giant. It's
I
basically a giant
have to run some
skyscraper.
numbers on that, Ken.
Yeah, it's like one skyscraper the size of New York City and the same height. It's wild. Well, bigger than New York City. New York City isn't 1,500 miles long.
It would be again from about Kansas City to New York City if you could
Okay,
imagine
so
that in
yeah,
height.
the whole freaking eastern coast. Unreal, unreal.
Yep.
Okay, I feel like I'm coming to the end of my limit here, and it's been yeah, it's been a good chat. Man, we've covered some very interesting topics. Like you said, some of these are definitely worth circling back on. So perhaps we shall talk again. But in the meantime, to our listeners, thank you for joining us. And please definitely check out Wallace's books. I'm going to pop them up on screen right here, and I'm going to have a link underneath, so you can go get those on Amazon. And while you're there, pick up my book as well. You might want to pick up my UFOs in the Bible and my Enuma Elish, which is the Sumerian mythology that I mentioned briefly. And yeah, definitely. Also, while you're on Amazon, hit the follow button. When you're looking at the author page, there's a little follow button there. That'll notify you of when we release a new book in the future. So please do that. And also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or the podcast if you happen to be on that medium. And do come back, and we will enjoy seeing you all again. Thank you, Wallace, for joining us.
Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Terrific chat. Thanks a
Thanks,
lot.
kid.
Okay, bye bye.